but I will, might be went 5 minutes over time, but I think we should still be fine. I'm sure you have a lot of comments, you have a lot of questions, but I would like to ask you to save them for the end discussion, and then we can discuss it among the panel. I will now give the word first to Jeff, who is presenting the first part of that paper, and then Sylvia will take over in a minute, again focusing on power and legitimacy in global climate governance.
Okay, thanks, Harry. The paper from Sylvia and I is entitled "Legitimacy in the Era of Fragmentation: The Case of Global Climate Governance." In this paper, we seek to build on the work that Fari has just put forward in relation to the topic of the causes and consequences of fragmentation of global climate governance. In this regard, we'll be focusing largely on state-to-state interaction and issues of legitimacy between states. So we'll be differing from the paper yesterday, which Karen Backstrand did, which was looking at legitimacy on a much wider basis involving non-state actors and others. The primary focus that Sylvia and I have taken in relation to looking at this state-to-state interaction in global climate governance is to focus on the concept of legitimacy, one of the key aspects of the logic of appropriateness in the analysis of international affairs. What we seek to show is how legitimacy might be used as a lens to understand significant institutional fragmentation that has occurred in this state-to-state interaction on climate change over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly the second half of the last decade. What we observed during that period is a significant fragmentation in the sites or forums of dialogue on the ambition and architecture of global climate governance. In particular, in the paper, we look at 3 different, what we have termed minilateral forums. This is using a term from David Victor and Moses Nayam and others, referring to small groups of states, somewhere between 5 to 15 groups of states. The particular minilateral forums that we're focusing on, 2 which arose, I guess, under US sponsorship and with Australian support, particularly the 2005 Asia-Pacific Partnership, and then the 2007 to 2009 US major economies meetings and US major economies forum. The third minilateral forum that we'll analyse is within the G8 system, within the G8 annual leaders meetings, particularly a dialogue within that forum that started in 2005, known as the Gleneagles Dialogue, which was initiated under UK sponsorship. Now, I think it's fair to say that within the existing literatures, there's some sort of scepticism and doubts over the importance of some of these minilateral forums. I think these doubts are driven firstly by some concern over the strength of the outputs from these minilateral forums, and hence their ultimate effectiveness in actually reducing emissions, and secondly some concerns over an apparent lack of transparency in these minilateral forums, and also lack of engagement with civil society. So I think it's fair to say that amongst academic literature and also some popular commentary, there was a view developed that these minilateral forums are in some sense a sideshow to the main event of what's going on within the UNFCCC, particularly during the second half of the last decade in the lead up to the Copenhagen COP. However, I guess our analysis is seeking to show that there are some important dynamics between legitimacy and power that's been going on in respect of these minilateral forums and how they interact back with the UNFCCC process. And in looking at this dynamic, it helps explain this fragmentation in these sites for dialogue on global climate governance. And also, we hope to show that by this analysis that these minilateral forums have served an important role in shaping some of the process and outcomes that we see within the UNFCCC system, certainly post-Copenhagen. Okay, well I'll hand over to Sylvia to take you through the legitimacy aspects of the paper.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So, the power legitimacy dynamic here. Legitimacy is about the justification of authority, and we can look at it in two different dimensions. Normative, where authority is built on adherence to normative conceptions of, for example, justice or democracy, or sociological legitimacy, authority built on societal acceptance. Now, sociological legitimacy is, of course, plays a key role in ensuring effective global governance, such as compliance with international norms, because of the almost absence of other enforcement mechanisms. And there should be some overlap between normative and sociological legitimacy. We also argue that power plays a particular role, well, other scholars have argued this, that power plays a particular role in the change dynamics of sociological and then over time also indirectly normative legitimacy. Now we apply a framework of legitimacy to these unilateral forums developed by myself and my co-author Wigma, and which is in turn built on a number of scholars and their work on normative legitimacy. So what I will do in the next slides is to, at the same time, very quickly go through the basic components of this analytical framework, the sources of legitimacy, and at the same time then apply them to these unilateral forums. So, because of time constraints, the description of the components and motivating them will be extremely brief, and so will be the explanation of our results. So, for brevity, we have kind of transformed our qualitative arguments in the paper into a table form where we have a kind of quantitative scale of legitimacy where 3 pluses are high legitimacy and 0 is the lowest in that range, just to help you read the tables that I will go through with. So we divide legitimacy in 3 major types of sources. We start with source-based legitimacy, and here we have 3 subcomponents. First, expertise, which because of the role that science plays in society and the reliance on rationality in governance has become particularly relevant as an important source of legitimacy. If we look at the UNFCCC, it has a strong track record with institutional linkages to scientific expertise through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, through its committee on subsidiary body on technology, science and technology. It doesn't mean, of course, that they always listen to all those aspects of science in that process. On the other hand, the unilateral forums, even though they do command quite a lot of resources of rich countries, they have not, with a few small exceptions, not tried to use expertise as something that a function of these forums. If we look at tradition as another factor in the literature, that means the length of time that an institution has been in place for a specific purpose, that can contribute to the institution's legitimacy. Now, all the unilateral forums were formed around 2005, and we argue, well, that's a relatively short time compared to the UNFCCC from the 1992. So, they were basically operating during the first 5 years of their existence. Going to the third one, if we look at discourse as a source of legitimacy, this depends on your normative starting point. So the degree to which a particular institution adheres to a discourse, we start here with cosmopolitan justice as the starting point. If you have that as a starting point, then the unilateral forums, for example, neglect looking at adaptation, look at vulnerability, and disregarding the principles of CBDR. You can argue based on that their legitimacy is significantly lower on this parameter. Well, for example, the G8 has a tradition of favoring a discourse very much focused on trade liberalization, privatization, and globalization. In the UNFCCC, on the other hand, there's a diversity of discourses, of course, but because of the majority, I mean, the G77 developing countries do have a way to kind of set the tone of the discourse towards